everyone, whether you were a bike shop owner or a sandwich shop, your first reaction was, holy smokes, I'm going to have to close my business.
In the weeks leading up to COVID closures, we actually had a dumpster catch fire inside of our primary warehouse. So we started COVID off with a literal dumpster fire.
It wasn't that long before all of a sudden we started seeing more demand again, and people started to realize that, hey, riding a bike is something I still can do.
There was a time where I was speaking to our SRAM rep, and he told me we have $2 billion of open orders. And I'm like, you can't possibly believe those are real orders.
Either every existing bicycle owner has to buy another one in the next 5 years, or the entire third world has to walk into the playing field and start buying high-end bicycles. There's just no way. Like it just breaks simple math.
Hello, listeners. This is Wade Wallace from Escape Collective. In this 4-part series, I wanted to explore the events that took place that led the bike industry to the troubling point it's at now. I spoke to over a dozen industry professionals from all over the supply chain, from well-run bike shops to forecasting analysts, distributors, the biggest brands in the world, and manufacturers. It's well known that the bicycle industry went through an unprecedented boom during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. During this period, travel came to a standstill. Gyms closed, social distancing became a thing, and the bike was the perfect antidote to that. The economy was propped up by governments and remained healthy, and people still had disposable income that they wanted to spend. This caught the bike industry off guard, and why wouldn't it? The industry had never experienced something like this before and relies on slow, predictable growth and often trying to sell more bikes to the same people each year, with the exception of e-bikes. Jump ahead to 2024, and the bike industry is in strife. The world opened back up again in late 2022, and people have resumed life as they knew it. New demand has come to an abrupt halt. New entrants into the bicycle market have not stayed as the industry had hoped. We're seeing massive inventory overruns at bike shops. Big brands are taking on extra warehousing space. Businesses such as Niner, Orange, Wiggle Chain Reaction have gone into bankruptcy. Otherwise profitable big brands have taken on debt to keep afloat. There are brands out there who are doing well, but they're the exception rather than the norm. In general, though, I don't think many would disagree that the situation in major cycling markets, aside from China, is pretty dire. This is the first episode of 4. We're going to bring you on a journey through the COVID feast, the storm clouds, the famine, and the lessons learned in hindsight. In this episode, entitled The Feast, we speak to a bike shop owner, a demand forecasting analyst for a distributor, direct-to-consumer CEOs, and a manufacturer to see what they experienced. I was surprised by their candor. It's clearly a stressful time for nearly everyone, and there were many emotionally charged discussions. People from big brands I spoke to asked to keep their names out of this as they were not authorized to speak to me, but clearly had much they wanted to say on this topic. I've paraphrased those conversations to preserve the identity of those people so they don't lose their jobs over this. Ellery Slater, along with her husband, own a bike shop in Boulder, Colorado called Sports Garage. It's one of the top independent bike shops in America of its kind. I've been there, and I know from many past conversations with Ellery that she's a top operator and a good business person. Ellery was also the brand manager for Pivot Mountain Bikes during the pandemic, and saw firsthand the reckless abandon that guided some of the bike brands during these initial stages of the boom.
Everyone, whether you were a bike shop owner or a sandwich shop, your first reaction was, holy smokes, I'm going to have to close my business. Initially, the conversation around the pandemic and what the public was going to need to do, it preceded any one area saying, hey, bike shops are essential businesses of the transportation grid, right? So in March of 2020, we were preparing to close our doors for an indefinite amount of time while carefully listening to the state dialogue about exemptions for essential businesses. And in Colorado, in addition to places like grocery stores and other places, drugstores and things like that, that were deemed essential, in the state of Colorado, bicycle shops were deemed essential businesses as a part of the transportation category. And at that point in time, when we learned that we would be keeping our doors open, it was cautious optimism.
What started to result with regards to how business went with, being able to keep your doors open and the lockdowns that started to happen and people's response to, outdoor activity, and how did that start affecting business?
It wasn't as though overnight this switch flipped and all of a sudden the phone just started ringing off the hook. I mean, the cautious optimism phase was like, it grew for a while. When things did start to break loose, the first thing that we saw was people calling around looking for a bike. And it's, kind of summer started. And initially those phone calls were for bikes that were $1,500 or less. So initially, when we noticed the first influx is when we were like, wow, this is really weird. Like, we have a lot of people calling and asking for bikes that are $1,500 or less. Clearly, these people didn't have a context for bikes, or they maybe would have looked through our brand selection and they would have been like, well, don't call that shop, right? They just have high-end mountain bikes.
And you had nothing for them by the sounds of it.
Nothing. But we were happy. We would like send them out. We would be like, well, you can call these guys, and these guys. Then we noticed that about 30 days into that, then people were asking for like $2,500 bikes. And then eventually that price became $3,500 bikes. So what we observed was mostly those people who were looking for bikes and that were new to cycling, we're thinking about like target market. What should we do? Should we change our product mix? Like what, how do we get through this? Like, should we respond to this first wave? We're having our own internal dialogue. Do we have the right product mix? Do we not? But then we noticed that people tapped out at 3,500.
Right.
Like if you were a person who you were looking for a bike, not because you were a cyclist, but because you're like, my family's bored and it's the pandemic and we feel like we need to go outside because you know what? Susie's not playing soccer. Johnny's not going to the rock climbing gym anymore. Mom can't go to yoga. We can't go to our club. Like, let's get some bikes. So we really differentiated. What we observed was that we really differentiated the buyer who was new to the sport from the buyer who was maybe re-engaging or just kind of going to be doing more of it during the pandemic, right? Because that was one of their only options.
And were you still getting queries for the $7,000 carbon fiber Yeti or whatever?
Yeah.
And those were still selling, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, our regular client base was still buying bikes. Those purchases in the high end, those were people who were already enthusiasts of the sport or active in the sport. And they, for example, had to cancel their European vacation, right? So now all of a sudden they can't go to Europe. They're not going to go on a Caribbean cruise. So they're going to take that disposable income, that recreational income that was already allocated, and they redirected it towards upgrading their outdoor equipment. Let's talk about that windfall. Let's stay in 2020 and talk about the word windfall.
Yeah.
Okay? And let's think about those people that are calling and saying, I'm looking for a bike that's $1,500 or less. I largely feel that as things progressed, we saw that actually bike shops, there were two types of independent bicycle dealers that experienced a windfall. One was a business owner who'd been a bit asleep at the wheel and he had a lot of dated inventory that maybe he couldn't sell through. How many bike shops have you walked into where there's the rack at the back and there's a road bike and it's been marked down 2 or 3 times, right? Because it's a couple of seasons old. It was a windfall for those IBD owners. They sold through all of their aging inventory. On the other end, you had the most sophisticated dealers who maybe had high inventory turns. They had no aging inventory. They were probably top performing dealers for their largest vendors or their sexiest vendors or their key partners. And if you were at the top of the food chain as a dealer, meaning you had ranked somewhere in the top 10, you were a priority to the manufacturer. So you want to keep, nobody knows how long it's going to last. No vendor wants to make their top 10 dealers mad. So when things started to constrain, if you were a high performing dealer, you did get some favors and when you got bikes.
And from where you sit, one of the high performing dealers, were you thinking at the time, like, this is incredible. This is like, we've never experienced anything like this? Or were you just, you said, I think, cautiously optimistic. Was that the lasting view that you took? Or was there ever a time where you're like, this just is awesome, and not let your guard down, but be comfortable with the situation?
It wasn't like we were like, woohoo, we were rolling in the dough. We're just showing up, opening the shop, like slinging carbon all day and closing the doors. Like, it was not like that. We had four guys on our team who would set their alarm every single morning. They each had a segregated list of parts we needed for our service department for repairs that they needed within the next 48 to 72 hours, even though we couldn't finish any repairs in that amount of time because of parts availability, right?
Yeah.
And each of them, they would break up the list. They would set their alarm at 6 o'clock in the morning because they knew that the order window when you could put items in a cart and check out at QBP opened at like 6:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. And it was a race to see how many of the parts they could get in their inbox and push buy now before every other bicycle dealer in the United States did the exact same thing. Every single morning.
So this was now your problem.
Yeah.
This was now your problem. Bikes were going out the window, but this was your problem. And there's a convenient saying, a good problem to have. What was that didn't feel like a good problem to have?
Well, I mean, initially, manufacturers were delivering bikes, right? And then things kind of started to pile up because they weren't getting their bikes. Remember the Port of Long Beach? And remember, we used to see the aerial view of how backed up it was, or there were countries where factories would close. So there was a point in time where, all we heard from our manufacturers was, well, our shipments are delayed. We're waiting for that to come. At the end of the day, did we make more money for a couple of years? Yes, we made a lot more money for a couple of years. But I would say on an hourly basis, we paid ourselves the same.
Is that right?
With 30% more effort to make every one of those dollars. What we started to do was we said, ship us whatever you had. Ship us every part you've got. We will fill the gaps. We took many, many bikes with no wheels, and we figured out the wheel thing ourselves. Actually, what we would do is we would unbox everything, right? We'd hang frames on the wall, parts everywhere else, and then we would build the bike. And so we did a lot of like creative things, I think, to get the bike built. But the real heroes of all of that, and I cannot underestimate this effort, to any high performing bike shop is going to know this. It's the staff that spent the time on the phone with the customers, trying to help them understand what was happening. Part of this landscape, the COVID landscape, especially in late 2021, was sold products that a customer was waiting for.
Bike shops were ground zero for all the signals that came through for this increased demand. All of those phone calls that were coming through ultimately led to an over-indexing of forecasting back to the supply chain. Pay attention to this because we'll come back to it later. On the other end of the supply chain, I had a very hard time getting someone to speak to from manufacturing. Most have NDAs signed with big brands and don't want to get themselves into trouble. However, I was able to speak to someone who is on the ground in Taiwan, where much of the bike industry's manufacturing takes place. His name is Rob Jatelis, and he owns Factor Bikes. For 20 years, Rob used to own the manufacturing facilities who made brands like Cervelo, Focused, Santa Cruz, components for Zip, Envy, and Bontrager. Rob knows this landscape well, and while now he only manufactures frames and components for Factor Bikes and Black Ink, he's still very well connected to this part of the industry and saw firsthand what his colleagues experienced.
When the pandemic was just starting, at least becoming publicly known, was right about Chinese New Year. It was during Chinese New Year. And I just remember sitting at home here in Taiwan, looking at this kind of unfold on TV and in the local newspaper. I'm like, this is going to be a problem. We could tell it was very quickly escalating to the point where at the last day of Chinese New Year, that was when the government basically didn't reopen. And this is really the really important time to hire people, because normally you hire people on a 1-year contract. It starts right after Chinese New Year and it runs to the following Chinese New Year. And that's kind of the hiring window. And if you miss that window of hiring people, those people will go work at another factory if they're already your trained workers, or, move to another industry or decide to stay, in the countryside at home. But it's incredibly difficult to hire in China after Chinese New Year. And I think that's all of Southeast Asia. It's not just China.
And what was the feeling in your gut and maybe the sentiment with other people in the industry in terms of like what was this going to look like for business?
I think, in the first days, we didn't know, but very quickly, the bicycle companies all started telling the factories, don't ship what you've already made. And we're going to greatly reduce our purchase orders. So then all of the factories responded by, okay, we need to cut capacity. So if we were planning on building 10,000 frames a month and now it's going to be 5,000 frames a month, that we now need to staff based on that number, which was a lot lower. And so the factories basically, didn't take back all the workers that they had let go, or they didn't renew contracts. At the same time, a lot of factories had a lot of product because leading to Chinese New Year, you always build a lot of product. And now the customers are saying, we can't accept it. Now it became a cash flow issue at the factory side because they've obviously paid all the workers, paid all the material, done all the work, but the brand is now saying, we can't take it at the moment.
You say that everyone reduced capacity, hunkered down, and then what happened?
The polar opposite. So then we enter, the throes of the global pandemic, and all of a sudden cycling becomes the great savior. And everybody and their brother now needs a new bike. Every brand is now scrambling, pushing their factories, pushing Shimano, pushing SRAM. We need product. And all of these factories are all in this state of, life support. And now all of a sudden they're being asked to way overproduce product that there was just no chance that this was going to happen. The big boys used their financial clout to really push down a lot of the smaller players. Specialized was here in Taiwan with bags of money going to different suppliers, securing their positions in line, willing to overpay to make sure that they didn't miss on this opportunity. What was happening? Some smaller brands were getting pushed down. Maybe you had an order in with your supplier for 300-400 Shimano Dura spikes. All of a sudden, your Duras disappeared, and somebody else got delivery of it. Somebody who was willing to pay more or was a more important customer of that factory. What
about to scale beyond capacity? Was that being asked of manufacturers?
Absolutely. Everybody was throwing out these crazy numbers, and they were insisting that you could do it, and they were asking people, to step up and invest, to build more production lines, to hire more people, and but all of the risk was at the factory side. Some factories were willing to take the risk, others were not. Obviously group sets became a huge issue as well, right? And so it used to always be that the frame was the longest lead time item, but now all of a sudden group sets became a year lead time. And so it then became, again, this super difficult balancing act for the assembly factories because there was this mismatch of lead times. Everybody understood what the lead times were, before the pandemic, and you knew, okay, I ordered my frames on this day, I ordered my group sets on this day, my wheel sets, and then it all comes in, and then we assemble it, and it all ships out. Assembly factories were having to rent 5, 10, 15 additional warehouses outside because it became this huge mismatch of timings of all of a sudden the frame is here, but the group set is still 4 months away. And DT is asking, hey, we need to ship your wheels. Oh, sorry, can you hold those? Because I know that DT had 4 or 5 additional warehouses they needed to rent. I know Velo Saddles had, I think, again, 5, 6, 10 warehouses they needed to rent that they never needed before, not because they were making too much. They were almost making the same amount of product as they had always been, but just because the normal cycle was you made it, you shipped it, you made it, you shipped it. Now it's like you made it, and then you were hoping that the other parts were ready so that the assembly factory could build it and they could ship it.
With group sets, I don't know if you can speak to this at all. I've heard Shimano have a hard policy of 5% growth year on year. They won't go above that. And they were very disciplined in that approach through the pandemic. Is that, and SRAM, I suppose, did go and create more capacity so that they could manufacture more. Is that your understanding, or?
That's all true. Yeah. I would say that Shimano almost ground to a standstill. Not just because of the pandemic, but yeah, they were just unwilling to accept, all of these crazy orders that were coming. They were unwilling to build the additional capacity. There was a time where I was speaking to our SRAM rep, and he told me we have $2 billion of open orders. And I'm like, you can't possibly believe those are real orders. And he's like, no, those are. Because there was so much what I call phantom ordering going on during this time as well. People were so scared, I'm not going to get my product. So they placed more orders. I'm not going to get my product. They placed more orders, far more than the actual demand. So, and the problem is SRAM was telling you, if you want your stuff, you got to get it in your order now for 2 years from now. And you're like, how do I plan for 2 years from now? I can't plan, what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. And you're telling me, I got to tell you how many bikes I'm going to sell 2 years from now. It just became this impossible thing. So everybody just started just throwing darts at the board. Okay, here's an order for 10,000 group sets. Wow. Please give these to me in 2 years. And so it just became this self-fulfilling prophecy of just this over demand created by this euphoria that people just thought was never going to end.
This podcast is fully funded by our members at Escape Collective. In fact, all of our content on our website and our podcast network is 100% supported by our members who believe that cycling media should be independent from the sport and industry we cover, and that we should exist to serve you rather than live or die by our ability to be a platform for the sole purpose of selling you more stuff. If you enjoy this podcast or any of our other work and believe in our mission of independence, please go to escapecollective.com/join and become a member today. Thank you for your support.
We were actually extremely distracted because in the weeks leading up to COVID closures, we actually had a dumpster catch fire inside of our primary warehouse.
If we look at the distributor's perspective, the largest in America is Quality Bicycle Products, or QBP, who services about 5,000 bike shops around the country. I spoke to Tae Huang, who was a forecasting analyst for QBP during the time of the pandemic, to understand what he experienced being in the middle of the supply chain between the bike shops and the brands themselves.
So we started COVID off with a literal dumpster fire. It shut down operations out of our primary shipping facility for almost a week. I think we had a significant amount of inventory get destroyed from smoke damage. So once the COVID closures started taking place, there was definitely a sense of like, whoa, 1-2 punch. What does this mean? And then you can easily Google it for yourself, but there was a significant amount of backlash because QVP let go of, I want to say it was around 100 employees over Zoom meetings. I think it was early April. Our sales just flatlined overnight. It was the end of the bicycle retail world as far as we are concerned.
When did it start becoming apparent that it's not all doom and gloom and that the actual industry was about to experience a windfall?
From pretty much the moment it started to ramp back up until late 2021, it was 50, 60-hour weeks. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't like analytical requests, what is selling? That was one of the first things. It was a major analysis of what categories were moving early in the pandemic and which ones weren't. And it was really obvious, but before that summer was even over, that the online retailers effectively never shut down, and they were hoovering up more of the Gucci stuff, carbon,
right?
Garmin head units, wheels, fancy tires. And then to the degree that the normal brick and mortar shops were doing business, it was a lot more everyday type of product.
And what were the challenges at that point with keeping up with this unexpected demand? What did you have to do to manage that?
This is something you don't want to quote me on, but my recollection is at least $1 million PO got canceled, if not more. And we burned a lot of bridges in those early few weeks because the rate at which sales has slowed down. I think leadership's approach was just, we can't take on any of this product that we promised. We had let go of all those employees. They were really just buttoning up, expecting an extended drought.
Right.
And so stopping any of that product from landing that we could have done, we did.
Got it.
And as a result of that, when things started ramping back up by late spring, early summer, it had put us at the back of the line, as it were, in a lot of cases.
Right.
A lot of our orders had already been reassigned to other people who had not canceled them. Yeah, that was a nasty shock. There was a lot of product that had extended delays as a result of that. A year, 18 months before we got that back in stock.
I heard a lot of this, Shimano's or whatever saying it's 400 days lead time for this crankset or whatever it might be. How did you deal with getting some of those, or did you just forego the sales?
In Q's case, we had enough weight, I think, to kind of push our way around the line. Our sales pitch is the product will get to you on time, quickly, and we always have it in stock. And for 20 odd years, that was enough to get us to the top of the top of the pile. Yeah, so we were getting a hold of what we could, but I mean the reality was at that point they were already shipping off what they'd anticipated they were probably going to sell for the year. They were probably already talking about what we're going to do next year. I think, again, you've probably heard, but Shimano made almost no attempt to increase their production lines with any kind of investment. I think they did some extra staffing or something.
Were things in the warehouse getting really lean at this time, and were you constantly out of product, or how was that cash going?
Yep. We were perennially out of stock. The volume was so high, we had to call in what we call the fire squad, which is when they ask office staff to help pick orders. While it was blatantly obvious that more and more units in the warehouse were empty and staying empty, that ended up creating other issues. I think 2020 or thereabouts, we were scheduling a complete overhaul to our website. And so features like back order had not been implemented yet. We did not have the ability to, show only in-stock items. So retailers were 2 straight years yelling at us, we need back orders and we need to be able to filter out out of stock product. We ended up rediverting a lot of resources to band-aiding those features onto the website over the course of the pandemic, just in time for sales to fall back off again.
Was first-party data issue for you, actually understanding what was happening, how much was being sold through, or did you even care about that at the time?
Prior to COVID and after COVID, I would say that was more of a concern. During the peak years of COVID, we were so far below what we wanted to produce that knowing what the retailers were selling on a bike perspective really didn't matter, because we wouldn't be able to deliver anything near what we wanted to deliver.
Right.
We were still pretty confident through most of COVID, that if we were having inventory issues, everyone else was also having inventory issues, our PO cancellations aside.
Yeah.
Right. Because we start ramping up for the season late in the winter, December, January, February, products coming in hot and heavy. So it's not like we had empty shelves to start. They got empty pretty fast.
Yeah.
For warehouses relative to everyone else's, we probably held strong longer than our competition.
Small upstarts were perhaps the most sensitive to the effects of the COVID boom. No slack in the supply chain, limited with cash, and up against the larger brands to secure their place in the production. Next, I want you to meet Tyler Jordan. Tyler is the co-founder and CEO of the Canadian apparel brand 7Mesh. He's not cut from the same cloth as many upstart apparel brands, though. His previous career was the CEO of outdoor apparel giant Arc'teryx. 7Mesh is a business designed around wholesale. That means selling to retailers and distributors. They have their own direct-to-consumer e-com site, but that's not how the business was set up to succeed. Here's what Tyler and 7Mesh went through at the start of the pandemic from the perspective of an apparel brand.
The amazing thing about it, I think, from a human experience point of view, was how fast everything happened. Just by total coincidence, we had quite a major product launch for that spring. So we had launched kind of a redone collection that was very significant for us. Dealers had booked it very strongly, and so we're really confident heading into 2020. And we had about 2/3 of those orders shipped to our dealers, and we're just launching the collection and getting things going. And the impact of the pandemic was that, like, essentially all of our dealers started phoning and emailing immediately saying, cancel all my orders or put them on hold. Don't ship me anything else. I can't pay for what you shipped me. I don't know when I'll be able to pay for what you shipped me. I might have sent some stuff back. And it was across the board. At the same time, we saw our e-com demand on our website pretty much go to zero overnight. There was a brief period of time where it didn't improve. And I sat down with our founders and I was like, guys, this could be it. Like, we're a young startup brand. And it's like, if this demand evaporates, like, what do we do now? But what we quickly saw was it wasn't that long before all of a sudden we started seeing more demand again, and people started to realize that, hey, riding a bike is something I still can do. And then our business accelerated from there.
And so what did you do with the windfall? How did you respond to the windfall, I suppose, with the demand that just quickly came after?
There were some aspects of the pandemic boom that were fun. And it was a terrible time in terms of worrying about what was happening to people and the impacts it had on the economies and our cultures and, our communities and our loved ones. And I don't mean to take away from that at all. We were a small business fighting to find its place in the world. And we ended up getting discovered by a lot of cyclists. And so our business acceleration during the pandemic wasn't so much from new riders coming into the sport. It was from passionate cyclists or somewhat passionate cyclists that were doing it more and were doubling down on their activity and were really getting into it. And so that was incredibly valuable for us as a very small business. And so there was some fun in that, where, that growth was good for us because we built inventory because of our big product launch. We were able to take advantage of the demand and sell a bit more than we otherwise would have. So we'd forecasted quite a bit of growth for 2020. But we ended up growing more than that, and, virtually sold, anything that wasn't bolted to the floor. Like all of our best stuff was kind of, our inventory was pretty low. And as a small business entrepreneurial that's fighting to find its place in the world and survive versus some very big competitors, we didn't like the source of the demand, but the added attention on the brand by people we're trying to reach was great for us.
It's a convenient kind of cliche to say that, good problem to have, but actually you could very easily go out of business with, while making money, sometimes with some of the problems presented or, just sold out of stock, right? And having people sitting there. What were some of the challenges that you faced with this increased demand, and how did you deal with them?
We navigated the period of the pandemic relatively well, and it was really, really hard work, and it didn't happen by itself. And we have some great people, and we did pull every trick and string in the book: relationship, network, cajole, find creative ways to solve problems in order to realize it. But we did okay. And because we work with, we want to work with certain people that have certain capabilities from a raw materials point of view, from a factory point of view, from a supplier point of view. If you think about it, as things get less commoditized and more specialized, it gets much more difficult for us to make any kind of substitutions and do anything different. For us, we needed to, there was a whole bunch of binary things where it's like we could either get that or we couldn't. And we either found more or we didn't, or were able to build a substitute in time or couldn't. We decided when the pandemic hit, before it started accelerating, we didn't cancel any orders. For example, it's one thing we never did is we believed we were growing because we were growing and there was demand for our product. And so we were comfortable that we were wanted to continue with our plan. What we didn't realize is that so many other brands, especially in our space where we use a lot of outdoor materials and kind of crossover and really backcountry, really high quality protective stuff, everybody else was canceling orders like crazy. The outdoor industry, which does a substantial, outdoor and ski, which do a lot of business for fall deliveries, they were panicking and canceling orders. And they were some of the brands are canceling orders and leaving the factory stuck with raw materials. And so we ended up getting caught in the crossfire where suddenly we found out that our stuff wasn't being built 2 months later, not because we didn't want it, but because they hadn't got around to calling us yet to check if we still wanted it.
How long did you think this demand was going to last for? Was this something that you even had time to think about? Or was there as this is just demand being pulled forward, this isn't the new normal? What were your thoughts about that at the time?
We were really clear that this is a bubble to some degree. And the real question is, how big a bubble is this and what's it like when it pops? And, at least in our case, it's not correct to say, oh, everybody just built stuff and thought it was going to stay that way forever. There were some loud voices that said they thought this was like the second coming of the bike industry. And we just disagreed with that, thought that couldn't possibly be realistic. We all believed that a bunch of these people that were coming into cycling or that were doubling down on cycling were going to really enjoy it and they were going to stay. And so we believed there was a component of it that was going to stay. The conversation for us was less about when is this going to end and more about how much of this is going to stay and have we turned the corner as much as we think we have.
Were you getting any order pressure from up the supply chain?
Yes, I would say, so from our supply chain perspective, it got very competitive to place the right things for the right factories. So as demand went up, it got competitive to make sure you could maintain space and get stuff built. You had to make sure all of a sudden you had to be on your best behavior because, the dynamic in the business relationship changed. And we saw, to be honest, for a long time, it's been imbalanced in the favor of the brands. And the factories have been, like I said, had orders canceled with no notice where they got left with specialized custom built materials for a brand. And the brand just said, well, I don't want them anymore. That's an imbalance in risk and reward that the pandemic finally allowed the factories to correct and say, no, if you want to place this order, then you are going to guarantee that you're guaranteeing the raw materials. And I want you to guarantee that with a raw material supplier or give me a letter of credit that covers me for that exposure, et cetera. So what we saw the factories rightly, in my opinion, have more power in the relationship, be able to push back on some of the what I've seen for a long time to be imbalances in the industry that let them kind of get more of a level playing field.
Was there any maybe temptation or requirement even from, line of credits or if you have investors or whatever to take on more because of payment terms or anything like that? Was that, did that play into it, especially being at a nearly zero interest rate phenomena time?
Yes, that was major for us, but just to be clear, I'd say that probably took about 5 years off my life expectancy stress-wise. To suddenly have a bunch of additional financial requirements happen, not just as hey, by next season. It was real time. It was like, I need this now. We were scrambling hard, and we're relying on the relationships, and we worked with a couple of great factory partners that like us and trust us. But they're part of companies as well that have to protect their own interests. And if they say, hey, we just got left with whatever by big outdoor brand, big cycling brand, make sure everybody's buttoned up here, then we had to get buttoned up like everybody else. And so as a small brand, people, normally bend the rules or not be too concerned. We weren't loose on credit. We had great relationships with people and we were meeting the kind of industry standard terms. When those terms suddenly became very hard, it was very difficult on us. And, it was not at all clear to us that we were going to make it through that at all. So it was a very, very sketchy time. And we, again, like I said, there were some ups and downs. There was some real fun during the pandemic, but nothing was easy. Even the good parts weren't easy. Everything was harder.
And when you say that, the financial requirements started getting really difficult and so forth, are you talking about the time of this increased demand when ordering was extra pressure in that? So the what I said earlier about a good problem to have, you could go broke while making money. Was that actually the case? With this increased demand came this extra financial pressure that was equally as hard to deal with.
Yeah, it was because, speaking for a small business, there's a lot of different ways to get into trouble. You need things to work. And this was during the boom. This was not during a bust or slowdown. This was during the growth phase. But during the growth phase, the start of that growth phase was very difficult on a lot of the factories. And like I said, it was really unfair to them, in my opinion. So they needed to protect themselves. And it was all happening so fast, they needed to protect themselves now. It was like, hey, you don't have to pay me now, but you need to send me proof of financing so that you'll be able to pay for the order when it ships. That's achievable, but it's not something you just have sitting in your back pocket. And it's not cheap or easy to set that up. If you want to pay for, you can buy insurance and you can get backing and you can get support. But it ties up your funds or requires certain guarantees, or it takes a while to implement. And so it was those kind of surprises and shocks were happening in kind of real time, and you're kind of trying to deal with them. So it was very difficult. And if maybe that's more absorbable or more routine to handle, if you're a big stable business, it's, everybody understands the lay of the land, but we're small and growing. And so things were changing every year. And we had to learn a lot of new tricks in that time period, for sure.
Occupying another niche in the industry, Josh Portner owns a parts and accessory brand called Silka. It's a small but mature business with a wide range of products with a relatively complex supply chain. Josh is well known in the industry and comes from the early days of the pioneering wheel brand Zip. And a decade ago, he bought the Silka name and reinvented the brand.
It was terrible, right? I think we'd had a couple of pretty dark years before COVID. When the Trump administration came in here in the States, they passed all these, tariffs and steel tariff and aluminum tariff and the China tariff. We don't do anything in China, but, that just has the effect of like raising prices on everything. And our business model had been to assemble everything in-house. And, we made a lot of parts from scratch, but we were assembling 100% here. And so, we were importing gauges and buying steel tubing locally, and maybe a casting would come from Taiwan, but a forging would come from Illinois. And then we would do the assembly here. And so that 10% tariff, like 17.4 stainless steel for us, went up 250%. And so, that week hit, and I remember calling the Andys, my board members, Andy Ording and Andy Miller, I was with it through the Zip experience. And they're just amazing guys who've been around and have done a ton of companies, and calling them and saying, okay, guys, I've got 6 weeks of cash. I'm just going to tell the employees to go home, and we'll pay them until we can't pay them anymore. But I don't know what else to do. But yeah, the timing just felt like it could not have been worse in the moment. Right. I had a good couple of weeks there where I just saw it all slip away. If this doesn't change quickly, we won't be here in 6 or 8 weeks, because that was truly all the cash we had on hand.
Geez. So what was the first indication that this wasn't all doom and gloom? When did things start becoming strangely positive? Or was there a time in between?
We were 2 weeks in, and I knew we had this, and this is where the timing starts to really work in our favor. We had this lubricant that we developed that we knew was good. We had the bottles, we had everything. We just couldn't make it and ship it. And I came downtown, got the company van, put all of it in the back of the company van, and drove it to my house. And what else were we doing, right? So it's me and my wife and the kids in the garage, and we're just bottling the lubricant, and I have nothing else to do, and this is all going to be gone. Let me just feel like I can do something. And I didn't expect that. Not only did we launch it and people started buying it, but like the YouTube, there's hundreds of comments, and that's when it really hit me, like, oh God, the whole world's at home right now. Like what else is anybody doing? From that moment on, it just felt like this incredible tailwind. And from there it was, I honestly barely remember the next year. Yeah.
And what about your other stuff? Because, as you mentioned, the hard goods, like pumps, for example, which you're well known for. You said you moved the manufacturing over to Europe and Taiwan. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And did they get shipped to you, or did they get distributed globally from those locations?
Both.
Both.
And so where the second place we start to luck out is, we, as the lockdowns happened, we had parts on the water. And so the stuff gets stuck, wherever ports, as lockdowns begin opening in places, it can be received and put out there. And then as that's happening, I think people everywhere are starting to get out of lockdown, but still a lot of them don't have jobs. Kids are out of school. People start buying bikes. I think like the rest of the industry, we got that whipsaw effect of, first month, everybody canceled everything, and that just piles on to the depression of, me with my little 6-week pile of cash. It was bad. And I know everybody went through a bit of that, which of course then makes everything that much harder when it does pick up. And now they're calling back, oh, actually I want that. And I want it yesterday.
Yeah. And how did you manage that situation when all of a sudden, like, everyone's realizing what you're realizing, and this is actually a windfall?
Yeah. So that in a way was our kind of big luck number two, that because we'd had all that product moving right as this was happening, for us, the whipsaw went from, oh my God, I have all this inventory in the channel dedicated to these customers who aren't taking it, and I'm now being charged money to store it. The day they showed up and said, actually, we need it, we were like, oh, actually, we still have it. Still have it. We were able from that moment on to really hyper focus on, okay, the stuff I do here in Indy, titanium goods and, chain lube and whatever, we are just going to do everything possible to not run out of that stuff. You always got to learn something, right? And I think the thing that COVID really taught me that we continue to implement heavily now is one, respect your supply chain, but two, understand your supply chain. And I think one of the beauties of the COVID supply chain was that so many of the suppliers opened up about their problems. I mean, my supplier database, Rolodex, and certainly ability to talk to suppliers about these things, it's completely changed. It went from, sorry, I can't do that, or sorry, I can't make it, or your lead time is 12 weeks. And now they know us well enough that they call and go, hey, I'm running behind. Here's the situation. Help me troubleshoot it. That's a very different conversation,
So this windfall, it doesn't sound like you were necessarily able to sit back and enjoy it. It just caused a flurry of activity on your side, trying to source materials and parts and to be able to make more product for this extra demand. Is that accurate to say?
Oh yeah, it was because remember, at the same time, you couldn't get people. Like even once everybody went back to work, not everybody went back to work, and so I mean, we probably averaged 50 to 55 hours a week for a year trying to keep up with demand on the stuff that we make here. About a year into that, we really started almost doing sort of like war game scenarios. Like, okay, this doesn't last forever. A container shipment from Taiwan to America went from $2,500 to $25,000. Aluminum went way up, steel went way up. It also became scarce, which drove it up further. And so, it was definitely a period where we were really looking at it thinking, okay, guys, like, we're growing in revenue and in volume, but it's not like extremely profitable. The thing I think our group got ahead of sooner, maybe than a lot of other people, was sort of this idea that, not all revenue and not all business was worth getting. And there were just certain things. We developed this strategy essentially based around 7 products. We called it Super 7. And we said, like, these are products that we need to focus on not running out of, and our inventory dollars need to be spent here. Yeah, I would say at the end of that first year, we got real serious about kind of wargaming the outputs. We really came out with 2 theories. We said, okay, the plausible theory A is that this huge spike in demand is new people coming into the market and that those people, some percentage of those people are going to stay in the industry and they're just going to fatten up all future business. Or the kind of the other end of the continuum was, we are just selling all sorts of extra stuff to all the same people we've always been selling to, plus a bunch of kids that have entered the market. And that in a sense, we're actually just borrowing business from the future. Right? If we double business today, it's just coming at the expense of some amount of business for future years. And then you try to game out what that is. If we, sold an extra 100 of this thing this year, does that mean we sell 100 less next year, or do we sell 20 less for each of the next 5 years?
Wasn't it tempting though, with this massive windfall that the bike industry has basically never experienced? And it sounds like you're working extremely hard, but to step back from that and to have that discipline is quite impressive versus just keeping up with it all. Because you don't know how long this is going to be. 5 years? Is this going to be 2?
Right. That was the FOMO element we worried about, right? I remember reading that article about, rad power bikes, like buying their own freighter and shipping it to the port of Portland or whatever it was, and thinking like, oh man, like those guys are crushing it. So, I wish I was in there. And then again, dialing it back and thinking like, hey, you stop thinking about, you are not them. And, here's our model, play to them, let's run our game plan. There was a speech given at the virtual Taipei show by a very significant industry person from a very significant company. And he showed a graph that essentially was saying they felt that this growth could continue out possibly to 2028. I remember like that just didn't sit right with me. And I kind of just in a notebook on a piece of paper, kind of just wrote that out, the math of it. And I remember calling Andy Ording and it's like Andy, if they're saying that this growth continues to 2028, and to do that from a bike sales perspective, either every existing bicycle owner has to buy another one in the next 5 years, or the entire third world has to walk into the playing field and start buying high-end bicycles. There's just no way. Like it just breaks simple math.
That's episode 1 of our 4-part series in our investigation into what brought the bike industry to the point of strife it's in now. In the next episode, we look at the early signs that this boom might not last forever. What were the red flags? What did all parts of the supply chain begin to experience, and how did they react?
In the history of what sport in the universe has the sport retained someone who tries the sport for the first time at 80%? No sport ever.
All these retailers that had been talking about how confident they are about next year, rapidly losing confidence.
You need to take these. You ordered them. Here they are.
Trying to do it in a conservative way so that you don't get caught holding the bag eventually.